Hello, and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Harle.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. And in this bonus episode, we'll be reflecting on a recent interview with Carol Homden, the chief executive of the children's charity Coram, which has been hoovering up other charities recently. 4 organisations have joined the Coram Group in less than a year. Emily, you went to meet Carol recently. There's a full write-up of your discussion on the Third Sector website. Seems like quite an interesting moment to speak to her.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting point in time for the Coram Group. Just to start, I want to give some context on what Coram is and what it does. So it brands itself as the UK's first and longest running children's charity, having been founded in 1739. It carries out a wide range of work, particularly due to the services it's acquired through other organisations joining the group. So this includes legal support, research, evidence work, advocacy, adoption, and therapeutic and educational programmes. The charity has been featured in Third Sector quite frequently over the past year as it's been expanding its remit by absorbing a raft of smaller charities, as you said. Now, this isn't a new strategy for Coram. It's been absorbing organisations for quite some time, but the recent ones caught our attention, particularly after the Good Mergers Index recently found that mergers were up by almost half last year. Carol has been chief executive of Coram for about 19 years, so by now she's pretty much a staple of the charity. Before this, she was commercial director at the Prince's Trust and also worked at the British Museum for a few years. She's also held a range of charity governance roles, including her current post as chair of Diabetes UK and a decade as the chair of the National Autistic Society. She was also made a dame in the most recent New Year's honours list, so it's quite a CV she's got there.
It certainly is, and quite a feat to have 2 big chair posts as well as being chief executive of Coram. One of the first things that I wanted to ask was how her governance roles informed her leadership at Coram, and I'm very glad that you asked her exactly the same question, and we're going to hear her response now.
I think it's a vital experience for anyone who wants to be a chief executive, and I would advise anyone who aspires to develop into senior management in a charity that firstly it's a duty to serve, and secondly that you will gain an enormous amount from understanding the governance responsibilities of trustees. So I first became a trustee of a local arts centre in my 20s, and then I was chair of a learning disability charity, and then chair of the National Autistic Society, and now Diabetes UK. It enables you to think about what it is that trustees actually need to fulfil their duties and the partnership that needs to exist between the executive and governance. But it also enables you to see that whilst the duty is to the organisation, there is a greater duty, and that is to the purpose.
Interesting how she framed that around understanding the needs of the trustees. I know often we have the discussion of how can the trustees better support the chief executive, but being on both sides of the fence, she's obviously looking at it from a very holistic perspective.
Absolutely. And understanding the needs and duties of trustees will really help her as a chief executive to maintain that strong relationship with her board. So I asked her what her advice to other charity chief executives would be to help them maintain those relationships and really help them thrive.
I think my advice to chief executives is that you need to understand what it is that the board needs to fulfil its duty, and its duty is to the purpose. It's not to what we currently do or who we currently employ. It is to the purpose. And the second thing is no surprises. So there should be no surprises for a trustee board. Obviously, there are events that occur, in which case, timely and proper information is really vital. But there should not be a sense of surprise to a chair in particular. If you are experiencing difficulties in problem solving a particular issue, then your chair should be your greatest ally. If they're not your greatest ally, then you only have 2 choices, which is either to leave or to work with the chair and the board to develop that relationship in a more generative way.
Pretty blunt there. Either leave or work with the chair and the board to develop that relationship positively.
And it seems like it's all about finding a path forward. And if that relationship is so broken down, there is no path forward that you can feasibly see, then yeah, maybe you're not the right one to be doing the job. But moving away from governance and onto strategy, as I mentioned, Coram has been absorbing smaller organisations to strengthen its services for years, but it has recently had a wave of new organisations joining the group. So in May last year, the Professional Association for Childcare and Early Years, also known as PACey, joined the group, followed by Leap Confronting Conflict in August, Kidscape in February this year, and most recently, Family Lives just this month. And when I spoke with Carol about this, she explained why the charity never uses the word merger when a new organisation comes into the fold.
A merger, in my view, is two organisations closing and setting up a new organisation. What Coram is involved in, this is the world's first and leading children's charity. We're not going to merge with anyone, but we welcome organisations to amalgamate and to join the Coram Group in pursuit of the common strategy and purpose. And that's really, I think, what has been distinctive about the development, is that we're very clear on why we're here. We're here to create better chances for children now and forever. And that means laws, lives, and systems, so operating at 3 different levels. And we have 7 defined strategic goals of what we want for children. And organisations that are aligned with those purposes and with those goals have asked to join.
I don't want to get into the weeds of terminology between merger and amalgamation, but I think it's very interesting that Carol says that she doesn't see these structural changes, acquisitions, mergers, amalgamations, whatever you want to call it, as a merger. And it is quite a dirty word in the voluntary sector, isn't it? We had Kate Lee on this podcast, the very first episode of the year, likening talking about mergers to talking about the menopause. It's not something that you're not allowed to do, but it's uncomfortable. And she said that that was because it's often seen as predatory to be talking about mergers. She is very much an advocate for mergers and saying that in the current financial climate, it's very much something that more charitable organisations should be thinking about. But very interesting that whenever we bring up this topic, there's a, oh, no, we don't want to call it a merger.
And it's something I've definitely seen on the news desk, is when you get a story in about 2 organisations entering a partnership, or there's lots of different terms that get thrown around as opposed to using the word merger. And I think it's so interesting, the reluctance to just name the thing. And we know at Third Sector, we know that mergers can take all kinds of forms, right? You can get more takeovers where a larger charity is absorbing an organisation. You get instances where 2 organisations are joining forces and forming a new brand. And you get instances where 2 organisations join forces and both retain their brands. So there's so many different shapes and forms that a merger can take. But what is interesting here is that in Carol's view, what Coram is doing is not a merger, because they are bringing in new organisations into the fold and still retaining their brands and services, but operating as a part of Coram. So when an organisation joins Coram, while they become part of the Coram brand and it's really the Coram Group that leads front and centre, they still often retain their legacy and their services and their name as well. So you've got Coram Family Lives, for example, as the most recent organisation to have joined the group. And they've sort of just added Coram to the front of it, but they're still retaining that Family Lives branding and the services that they provide. So I think there is an important distinction to be made there. But when we talk about mergers, we really need to be aware that they can come in all shapes and forms.
And in the most recent cases of Coram amalgamations, as I think Carol would like to call them, they are generally smaller organisations joining this bigger entity, right?
Yes, these organisations are typically a lot smaller than Coram. And Carol mentioned that organisations are willing and offering to join the group. So she told me that every organisation has their own reasons for wanting to join Coram. So, for example, PACey had some acute financial challenges that it was dealing with, while Kidscape was more of a transfer of services that intended to strengthen the provision that it can provide. And Carol told me that most of the organisations that have joined Coram sought out the opportunity for themselves rather than Coram looking for new organisations to come into the fold. So I asked Carol, when a charity approaches Coram, what do they look for that makes it a good prospect?
So there is a little mantra that I use in induction, which is to say, at Coram, we are the first, the only, the biggest, or the best, or we don't do it. So organisations that might be interested in joining in with the group and the mission to bring their expertise so that it can fire on more cylinders as a result of using shared infrastructure. That would be what we were looking at. We were looking at what is the integrity of that expertise? How is it distinctive? Is it the first, the only, and the biggest and the best? And in the way in which the group has developed, there are two principles. One is no duplication, and the other is no disbenefit. So you don't want competing processes within a group. You want the same processes being used to maximum effect.
I think that point about avoiding duplication is really key to Coram's overall strategy. You can see the vast range of services that they offer. What they do is so broad. And it's partially because of that, because they're avoiding duplicating the things they already provide, and they're expanding into new areas that will make lives better for children. And Carol told me about the vast benefits that they've gained through these amalgamations, as she calls it. Expertise, staff, infrastructure, and existing services that have trust is really key there. But some people in the sector might question whether this amalgamation, a larger charity hoovering up smaller ones, might leave a bit of a size gap in the sector, a situation where big organisations continue to get bigger and the number of small to medium-sized charities dwindle. So to play devil's advocate, I asked Carol how she would respond to that view.
All of us who are working in a charity, all of us who are CEOs in particular, must ask the question, are we as effective as we can and should be? What would make us more effective? If we are small and perfectly formed, economically sustainable, and delivering excellent services to our constituency, then there is no reason to think of changing that, particularly if we are, for example, locally based and very well embedded with the network of services there. If, however, we are engaging in pointless competition for contracts that involve endless TUPE between one organisation or another, if, for example, we're not able to be resilient enough to address what we can see as challenges in terms of quality or in terms of speaking up for our constituents or making a bigger difference, then we have an absolute duty to say, how would we do it? So I think it does take courage. It takes courage, it takes inspirational leadership, but we have to remember it's not about me. It's about those we serve.
And for people that don't know, TUPE is when staff are transferred over from one organisation to another to deliver a contract.
Now, she said several times over the course of these clips, it's all about purpose, whether you're thinking about your chief exec chair relationship, whether you're thinking about the needs and responsibilities of trustees, whether you're thinking about two organisations coming together or multiple organisations coming under the umbrella of one larger one. It's all about what is in the best interests of the people or the causes that we exist to serve. Hasn't really addressed the question of the health of the sector, I guess, when you have lots of smaller organisations in effect disappearing and the bigger organisations getting bigger, apart from just to say, well, if that's going to mean that services are delivered better and there isn't this unnecessary competition, then perhaps it's for the best.
And I think a key point there as well is that the smaller organisations aren't necessarily disappearing entirely. They're still continuing to deliver the services, but armed with the infrastructure of a larger organisation at the helm. So I think the point around minimising competition is a really key one, and is something that we talk about constantly in the sector. Is there's so much competition for contracts, there's so much competition for funding. Would this, as a business structure and a strategy, improve that? Perhaps. Now, I'm not saying that every organisation should be embarking on this kind of strategy, because for the health of the sector, that wouldn't work. But it does seem to be working rather effectively, in Carol's view, for Coram.
Now, shall we move on to your favourite question to ask charity chief executives?
Yes, I can't leave a chief executive interview without asking them about the government's relationship with the voluntary sector. So I asked Carol if, in her view, the civil society covenant has been effective in strengthening the government's engagement with the voluntary sector.
Well, I was around for the previous one. No. I mean, I would say that there is a positive tone of voice and genuine and generative engagement. And that is important and has been somewhat lacking with multiple changes of ministers and so on. There is a generative engagement, but there's always more that can be done on that. I think open policy making is a skill that's extremely important at the heart of government. Coram's position in relation to this is that we are the people we've been waiting for, and that's all of us. So we need to utilise the expertise and evidence we have, particularly enabling children and young people's voice and the evidence that's derived from it to inform policy making. But it is government's job to government. So our job would be to advise, our job may be to implement if we are appointed so to do. But we're only going to achieve change for children at a systemic level if we see that relationship as symbiotic.
And in terms of actionable change that you would like to see from government in making sure that relationship can be symbiotic, what would you like to see in terms of enabling that relationship with the voluntary sector to work in a more effective way?
Well, I have a problem with that question.
Okay.
Because what is the voluntary sector? Government can't possibly be expected to have a relationship with 25,000 children's organisations. And that's not what all of those organisations are there to do. So I'm not sure that I could point to a single change. I think the most important thing is an attitude of mind. It is an openness to hearing different voices and to joint problem solving. Some of the problems that we face as a society are profound ones. And if we look at the issue to do with children's digital life, for example, government has commissioned a consultation. It is engaging in pilot work. It is certainly active in learning from the international experience. It is looking at the question of how best to regulate in a circumstance in which law takes ages and digital media pop up every 10 minutes. That is an open policy-making process. And I think that that is the only way in which we can collectively really respond to some of the bigger challenges. I don't think that it is helpful necessarily to jump to the assumption that structural reform is the solution.
So there's quite a lot in that response there. And I found Carol's view on this quite fascinating, because it begs the question of whether agreements like the Covenant are even relevant to grassroots organisations on the ground. Of course, we have work going on behind the scenes to ensure that local government is working closely with small grassroots organisations, which is really important. But expecting charities with limited resourcing and high demand to also be engaging in conversations about structural reform might be unrealistic and, as Carol sees it, not what they exist to do. So there's definitely some food for thought there about the roles that we expect charities to play and what hats they ought to be wearing.
Indeed, considerable food for thought in all of that. And you explore some of these themes in greater depth in your long read, which is available under the Features tab on the Third Sector website. Well, Emily, thank you so much for sharing those clips with us. And thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed hearing about Emily's interview with Carol Homden. This episode was produced by me and Navpal.